And I said the problem with using dictionaries is that dictionaries are concerned with giving the definition of words rather than concepts. And they tend to be rather vague because they want to cover all possible uses. And as I said last time, it keeps changing because people use a word wrong and then it catches on and the dictionary says, well, we better include that usage because people are using it that way. And furthermore, dictionaries are defining words, so what they do is they tend to give a list of all the concepts associated with that word. When you're defining a concept, you're focusing specifically on one of the concepts, and you want to be as precise as possible. I always think that it is important, being a philosopher, philosophers, one of the things that philosophers are prone to obsess about is being careful in giving definitions, carefully defining one's terms. As I said last time, if you're going to have a debate about something, you better make sure that the people having the debate are on the same page about what it is that they're talking about. So last time I gave the example of where you can use using the same word can disguise the fact that you're using two slightly different concepts, like human. Human can be used in the sense of human being, which is a slightly different concept from human, the biological category. So, you must be clear in defining your terms. This isn't something that only philosophers obsess about. One of the things that philosophers tend to advertise is that philosophy majors are among the very best performers on the LSATs, the exams you have to take to get into law school. And I think part of the reason is that similar talents are required amongst lawyers. Lawyers have to be very precise about the language they use. And in fact, one of the areas where you have to be incredibly precise about the definition of terms is the law, because you need to be able to have a clear line around a particular concept when the concept is used in a law. So for example, this is a famous example. Suppose a sign says, no vehicles in the park, $100 fine for violating that rule. And you go skateboarding in the park. Have you violated that rule? Are you now eligible for a $100 fine? How would you settle that?
Defining what a vehicle is and see if the skateboard qualifies.
Exactly. You would need to have a very precise definition of vehicle. If you had a good lawyer, presumably your lawyer would argue, your lawyer would cost a lot more than $100, so I would just pay the $100. But if you defended yourself, presumably you would argue something like vehicle involves a motor or something like that. But it turns out that there are legal definitions of most of the terms that crop up in the law. And you have to be able to be good at giving definitions. And I don't think that, I think that it's fair to say that you don't really have a concept if you can't at least give the beginnings of a definition of it. If you say, well, you know, I have this concept, and then somebody says, okay, well, define it, and you can't do it, then, you know, in what sense do you really have the concept? Okay, let's turn to page 44, because that summarizes the rules for definitions. And we're going to go through them in turn. Some of them we're going to say are more important than others. So the first rule is, a rule for a definition is, 1, include a genus and a differential. Now, let's give an example of how a definition might look. Sometimes in philosophy, we do things like, so for example, suppose we're defining the concept chair. A pretty simple concept, a concept that you have all mastered, I hope. You know what a chair is. Okay, so how would you write out a definition? Well, colloquially you would just say a chair is, and then what would follow the word is would be the definition. Sometimes in philosophy you see this combination, equals df period. That just means what follows that is the definition. So this word represents a concept. Remember, words and concepts are not the same thing. And of course the word chair can be used for other things. You can talk about the chair of a department. And that doesn't mean that you're allowed to sit on them. But as we cannot convey concepts except by using words, we have to use a word. But this is supposed to represent a concept rather than the word itself. So if it were the word itself, you would have to do like it does in Webster's and give a list of all the concepts associated with it. We're just going to say we're talking about the chair, specifically, you know, the kind like the one you're sitting on. Sometimes in philosophy they indicate that we're talking about a specific concept among the many ones associated with a word by doing a little subscript or something like this. So chair, S for sitting or something like that, but we're not going to bother with stuff like that. Okay, so if you want to define chair, the definition would go there. And what these rules are rules for a good definition. And the first rule is include a genus and a differentiate. Well, we already know what a genus is, we just haven't settled how to pronounce it, because I said genus last class and I'm saying genus this class. What would be a genus or genus for chair?
Piece of furniture.
Furniture. Yes. Now, actually, all kinds of things would be groups that chairs would fall into. So, for example, middle-sized object might also be a group that chairs would be included in. Why would that be a bad genus to use? Yeah?
Because it's less specific.
It's less specific, that's right. So you want the genus to be more general than so when we're talking about concepts, we're talking about species. These are not specific referents. A specific referent of the species would be this. This is a particular referent of the species chair, because it's an example. But chair is a general classification term that includes a bunch of different things. So it counts as a concept, and it's a way of organizing the world. So it's already at a certain level of generality, which is why it's a species. But then we want to go one level of generality up, one and only one level of generality up. We don't want to get too general. If we get too general, we could just say thing. That would cover just about anything. So include a genus, in this case, okay, a piece of furniture. So we've announced, so suppose you didn't know what a chair was. When you're given the genus, this tells you, oh, it's that kind of thing. It gives you a ballpark. And you say, okay, I get basically what a chair is. I understand now it's not a piece of fruit or something like that. I won't try to eat one. But you still need to know what kind of piece of furniture, because there are many kinds of piece of furniture. And that's what the differentia is. So the differentia is what tells you what is special about a chair that distinguishes it from other members of the genus. So what is it that makes something, a piece of furniture, a chair, rather than other pieces of furniture? Yes?
A tool for sitting.
Tool for a piece of furniture. Well, probably we don't need tool because we've got piece, but so let's say for sitting on. So this would be the genus, and this would be the differential. Now, sometimes, so one way that the textbook puts this is that the genus is a bit like your family name or surname, and the differential is a bit like your first name. It tells you, you know, this tells you, explains what kind of thing you are, and this tells you which of those kinds of things you are. All right, they should be explicit. Sometimes in definitions, the genus often gets left out, and sometimes replaced by the word when. For example, if you say fear is when you think you're in danger. What is the genus that has been omitted there? Emotion, yeah, or feeling. Okay, so let's do practice quiz 3.1 on page 38. And the next rule is the one that we're going to perhaps focus the most on. And this is, the definition should be neither too broad nor too narrow. Now, these concepts are related to a couple of concepts that we introduced last time, which is the two concepts that we introduced last time were jointly exhaustive and mutually exclusive. I'll explain that in a second. But first of all, think of it this way. A definition of something is too broad if it covers too much. So the analogy of broad, too broad, it's too wide, it covers too much. So, a definition of a chair, and remember our definition of chair was a piece of furniture for sitting on. This definition would be too broad if this definition covers too much. In other words, if this definition is true of things other than the term being defined. So if this definition applies to something that is not a chair, then this definition is too broad. If you want to show that a definition is too broad, so too broad covers is true of non-X's, where X is the thing being defined. So in this case, chair is the thing being defined. So a definition of chair is too broad if the definition, this part, is true of non-chairs, true of more things than chairs. If you want to show that a definition is too broad, you come up with a counterexample. A counterexample, in this case, would be something that the definition is true of that is not a chair. Can you come up with a counterexample here?
Couch.
A couch, yes. Is a couch a chair? No. Now this is where you might get it. Someone who is defending this definition would say actually a couch is a subspecies of chair, and you could get into that debate. But if you wanted to say no, chair and couch, two different things, then a couch would definitely be a counterexample that shows that this definition is too broad. Does that make sense? Makes sense now. Let's see if it makes sense in your homework. Too narrow, conversely, is when there are some chairs that the definition excludes. So, for example, is not true of some X's. So a counterexample here would be an example of a chair that the definition excludes. Does that make sense? Now, what's slightly odd is that a definition can be both too broad and too narrow. You think if it's too broad, it can't be too narrow. Well, it can be too broad in some places and too narrow in others. So can you think of a chair that this would not be true of?
Maybe one used in an art piece that you're not supposed to sit on.
Yeah. No, imagine that there was a chair made out of golden toothpicks or something, right? And if you touched it, it would collapse. It's still a chair, right? If somebody said, what's that? You would say, it's a chair. Is it for sitting on? God, no. You're not allowed to sit on it. Or what about an electric chair? I don't think you want to sit on that. So it's possible. Now those are a little bit more outlandish examples, but you get the basic idea that that would be an example of something that is both too broad and too narrow. Let's try another definition just to test on knowledge of these. Let's define dog. I said we'd come back to that because you all know what dogs are. Everybody here is totally confident in their mastery of the concept dog, right? Good. And what's more, you've known about dogs since you were very young. This is not a concept you have recently acquired. Yes, in my first week of university, I now know what a dog is. No, you knew what a dog was a long time ago. So you should have no problem in giving me a definition. Who's going to give me a definition? Yes?
An animal which is a domesticated descendant from wolves.
All right, define wolf then. If you're going to use terms that are themselves a little open to question. Actually, this is covered by, we're going to get into this. Oh, here it is.
Circular?
Yes, that's right, circular. So for example, I can't remember if this one's in the book, but there's a dictionary that defined grazing as eating grass. And then suppose you didn't know what grass was, or you were unsure, which seems unlikely, but let's suppose. And you looked up grass, and it defined grass as what grazing animals eat. What's the problem? The problem is each concept relies on the other, and you're none the wiser. I mean, it seems like the problem is less clear because you're familiar with both of those terms. But suppose I said, I'm going to define for you the term blurgle. A blurgle is a thing that gleeps. And you say, okay, what is it to gleep? To gleep is to be a blurgle. Now we're clear, right? Now, you are none the wiser because both terms are unclear and neither explains the other. So if you're going to give a definition, it helps if you avoid giving... Now, of course, you can't avoid giving any other terms because that's what a definition is, to link one concept to other concepts. But wolf seems a little bit cheating, particularly as you probably knew what a dog was before you knew what a wolf was, right? Unless you were raised by wolves or something. So, should we try again? Yes?
A domesticated four-legged canine?
See, canine is even worse. I mean, because canine, again, is something that you learned fairly recently, right? You learned dog before you learned canine. Didn't you? I'm betting, unless your parents are scientists or something. So, okay, let's say animal. That's a fairly safe genus. What else? What can we do? Give me a definition that will work on a kid. Because presumably that's when you learn the definition.
That barks.
That barks. That's probably pretty close to the definition you started with, right? Now the definition you started with was one of those. Actually, that's called an ostensive definition. An ostensive definition, and that actually is the way, I think, that most kids learn their first concepts. You know, what's a chair? One of these. What's the problem with an ostensive definition? Yeah.
It's too broad.
And it's too broad and too narrow. It's too narrow because, well, it's just generally pretty hopeless. I mean, what's the problem with me saying, suppose I was going to, again, I think it's disguised when we give examples of things that we already know, but suppose there's a technical term called, I don't know, flanging. And I want to define flanging, and I say, not phalanges, F-L-A-N-G-I-N-G. And I say, here's a flange. What's the problem? It's a key. No, I'm saying that there's a feature of the key that is a flange, yes.
You're only showing like one specific example, you're not showing a broad.
Yeah, there's one thing is I'm only showing, so you see it here, and you don't know if, you know, well, is there a flange on this one, or is it something specific to this one? And so that's one thing is too specific, but the other is it's a little bit too general because this key has many features, and you don't know which of the features I'm pointing to. So for example, why is it, I think it's pretty amazing that kids ever learn anything, because if I say this is a chair, how do they know I'm not defining the word black, or thing with legs, or plastic thing, or sphere of time and space, you know, because or finger. I mean, dogs think everything, whenever you point at something, you're just saying finger every time. You know, they just focus, they don't understand the, I mean, for one thing, kids appear to get this whole pointing thing. They make a little dotted line go from the end of the finger to, and they have this idea that the world is divided up into medium-sized objects. They don't think when I say this is a chair, I'm talking about a tiny little, you know, the exact point where I'm focusing on. They don't think, oh, that's a chair, that little chunk of black plastic, that's a chair. They think, oh, okay, this whole thing. So this is one of the reasons why linguists and psychologists think we come hardwired to view the world in a certain way. Anthropologists dispute this, but who cares about anthropologists? Because otherwise we could never learn words in the first place. So the trouble with ostensive definitions is, if I'm told that this is a chair, am I going to think that the lazy boy in your living room is a chair? Well, it doesn't look much like this at all. I mean, am I going to think that a chair has to have like a table attached, or has to be black, or has to be made of plastic? Nothing is given in an ostensive definition, which is why we need better definitions. So you need to, and this looks like a little bit better. Animal that barks. Is this too broad? Who says yes? We'll be cautious. If it was too broad, that would mean what?
Another animal has to bark.
There are other animals that bark. In other words, there is something that this is true of that is not a dog. Are there other animals that bark? Yes.
I think that the sound that sea lions make is called barking.
Yes, it is. Seals bark. You know, or.
Wouldn't you kind of have to define bark then?
Yes, I mean, there's some point at which you have to stop the chain of definitions, but certainly it wouldn't help if barking was defined, as it quite likely would be.
Because at that point, there's technically like spiders that would bark, in a sense.
Well, really?
They just make like a loud croaking noise, kind of.
Jesus, spiders are scary enough as it is, but if they actually make noises, oh my God, where do these spiders live so that I can avoid it? That would probably be Australia, because Australia has like spiders that will eat birds and stuff like that. Just don't go to Australia. It's full of the most poisonous things in the world. I think that's why Australians win a disproportionate amount at sporting events, because they're running from things at all times. Yes, that a seal would be an example that shows that this definition is too broad. Unless, of course, you define barking as the sound a dog makes, but of course that would be cheating and that would violate the circularity rule. Is it too narrow? What kind of example would show that it's too narrow? Yes?
I have a dog who I haven't heard bark once.
I like that dog. All dogs should be like that. Yes, you can actually have a surgical procedure done to have the barking removed from your dog, and it should be done on all dogs. But actually, besides that, there is even a breed of dog that is barkless. It sounds more like a tree. It's called Basenji. Basenji is a type of dog that doesn't bark. In fact, Basenjis basically screw up any definition for dog, because they can also climb trees. I mean, I'm not even sure they are dogs, except that they look like dogs. And actually, a friend of mine had a Basenji, and he said he didn't even care about that, but the kicker that made him believe that Basenjis were not dogs is that when you drive with them in the car, they don't stick their heads out the window, so they can't be dogs. But yes, a Basenji appears to show that this definition is too narrow, because it's a dog, but it doesn't bark. So it is something, well, the definition is not true of Basenjis. Okay, let's have a look at some exercises to deal with too broad and too narrow. Oh, I guess we have to talk about essential attributes. Yeah, you can give definitions. I mean, one of the if definitions fail these two, sometimes it is a clue that your definition is, the genus that you picked out is inessential. In this case, it's the differentia that's inessential. And here's the test. Well, first of all, what do I mean by essential? An essential feature of something is a feature that, and you can write this down, is a feature that, if it didn't have it, it wouldn't be that thing. Now, that's not a very good definition, but it's the best I can come up with. So, an essential feature of a thing is a feature such that, if it didn't have it, it wouldn't be that kind of thing. The example that philosophers always use is, being unmarried is an essential feature of a bachelor. Why?
It's almost like using the definition of bachelor in a way.
Well, what you have to ask yourself is, can you imagine a bachelor that lacked that feature, that lacked the feature of being unmarried? Would that even be possible? Can you have a married bachelor? No, by definition, you can't have a married bachelor. Why? Because being unmarried is the essential feature of a bachelor. So, a way to tell whether or not you're focusing on the essential feature is to ask yourself, can I imagine a whatever it is I'm defining without that feature? Can you imagine a dog without a bark? Yes. Usually when people are giving this definition, they say four-legged as well. But is four-legged an essential feature of dog? Well, what you do is you test yourself. Can I imagine, does it make sense to say a three-legged dog? Is that possible? Yeah. Sure. That's possible in the way that a married bachelor is not possible. So clearly being four-legged is not an essential feature of dogs. So what you're trying to focus on is the essential features. What is it that really makes the thing what it is? And sometimes that's pretty hard. And of course, it's easier for biologists who think that they've got a grasp on this. So the essential feature of, you know, a dog is that it is of the, is it genus or species Canidae or whatever. So that's why biological definitions can be a little bit more precise, because it is really, if something is not of that grouping, then it can't be a dog. But if we're working with the concepts as we use them colloquially or as we acquired them, it's harder to come up with. All right, with that in mind, that was rule number 3. State the essential attributes of the concept's reference. I'm just going to abbreviate that as essential attributes. So all of this is on page 44. All right, let's look at practice quiz 3.2. What are the main rules? We've already, yeah, the remaining rules are fairly self-evident. Don't be circular. We've already seen the example of circular, well, we can come up with an example of circular. If we define dog as an animal that barks, and then we define barking as a noise that dogs make, that's entirely circular. Because one depends on the other. And in general, you want to avoid using definitions that rely too much on terms that are very close to them. So canine and dog would be another risky one. If you say a dog is a canine, and then you say canines are dogs. Or if you say canines are dogs and wolves, you're still not explaining what makes them that. That's just a list. So, again, to illustrate why just giving a list of things is not a good definition, imagine I tell you, I'm going to define fleek by giving you examples. Here's a fleek, and here's a fleek. Go out and find some more fleeks. You don't know what makes something a fleek. I mean, suppose you bring me another bottle and I say, don't be a fool, that's not a fleek. This is a fleek. You don't know why this bottle is a fleek and the bottle you got isn't. Because I've just given you examples. I haven't told you what it is that makes them that. That's what a definition is supposed to do. So just to say, so to define canine by saying dogs and wolves are canines, that doesn't help you. It doesn't tell you what's special about dogs and wolves and why zebras aren't canines as well. You have to be able to explain. Right, so don't be circular, don't use terms that are too closely related. That's what a thesaurus is for. What's a thesaurus? Yes?
A reference of synonyms.
Yes, so for example, if you're tired of using the same word over and over, you look in a thesaurus and come up with a different word that covers basically the same thing. But I think thesauruses can be risky things because often there can be precise differences between things. Like I said last time about jealous. Did I talk about jealous and envious with you guys? I didn't, that was with the other guys. Okay. Who thinks that jealous and envious are synonyms? What's a synonym? Means the same. Are jealous and envious synonyms? If they're not synonyms, what's the difference? That's an interesting suggestion, but I don't think it's quite right. Here's what I think is the correct definition. Envy is to do with inanimate things, and it tends to be with property. I am envious of the fact that my neighbor drives a Ferrari, let's say. I wouldn't be jealous of that. Jealousy is confined to human relationships. So, for example, you are jealous of someone if they're dating your ex or something that you still have feelings for. Jealousy, for example, is the cause of all the problems in the Shakespeare play Othello. Whereas envy is to do with stuff. I am envious of you because you have the latest iPhone. but I'm not jealous of you because, well, unless, you know, I don't know if the movie Her is anything to go by. Maybe jealousy can be an emotion attached to iPhones. But that's the difference. Here's another one. What is the difference between these two? Disinterest, or let's say disinterested, and uninterested. There is a difference, and it's an important one. Who has used them interchangeably? Yeah, people do. It's a common mistake. What is the difference? Yeah.
Is the difference that disinterested means that you were interested in it, then you
You lost me.
decided not to?
I was interested, but you burbled on, and now I'm disinterested. No. Let me put it this way. You would, if you were appearing before a judge, you would want her to be one, but not the other. I'll tell you. Uninterested means bored. Sadly, most people use disinterested as if it meant that, but it doesn't. Disinterested means unbiased. So if you've heard the phrase, having a vested interest in something, I have a vested interest in whether or not a company I'm invested in stays in business. So for example, if judges have a vested interest in a company, they can't be the judge on a case related to it, or they can't be the judge on a case involving their relatives. Disinterested means I don't have any interest, I don't have any specific vested interest in this case. That doesn't mean I don't find it fascinating. I might find it fascinating, but I'm unbiased. So disinterested means unbiased. Uninterested means bored. Important distinction. Don't lose it. All right, what are the remaining ones? Don't use negative terms unnecessarily. Yes, telling me what a thing isn't very informative. It doesn't tell me, you know, so suppose you drink something and I say, ooh, and you say, what? And I say, well, it's not fatal. You know, that doesn't tell you much. You want to know a bit more than that. Who's heard of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Okay. From my generation of nerds, this was a great series of books. It was the first real combination of humor and science fiction. Written by a guy who actually used to write for Doctor Who, wrote a couple of episodes for Doctor Who before he did that. Douglas Adams, sadly now deceased. But there's a great line in in the first book where, and it's funny precisely in a way that kind of illustrates the problem. He describes these alien spaceships come and hover over major cities, the Vogon fleet, before destroying the Earth. And he said the Vogon ship hung in the air in exactly the way a brick doesn't. See, it's funny because it's uninformative. And that's the problem with using a negative definition. Finally, don't use vague, obscure, or metaphorical language. You know, life is, if somebody says love is a red, red rose, well, no it isn't, right? That's a metaphor. Your definition has to be non-metaphorical, it has to be literal. All right, I will see you next time.